coming. My name is Dr. Hosanna Krienke. I'm a researcher for the Diseases of Modern Life project, and I'll be telling you all a little bit about what I do on that project and how it fits in with some of the themes of our research. So I work on convalescence or rehabilitation in the 19th century, in the Victorian period. So first I wanted to ask you all about your own experiences of illness. What do you do to try to recover from illness quickly? Rest? Good. Other ones? Lots of sleep, nutrition. I love a big bottle of orange juice whenever I get sick. I don't know, it might be mythic or whatever, but vitamin C. Others? Medication, yes. Doctor always wants to make sure that you're pro-medication. So we have a lot of strategies where we want to condense the experience of illness to speed it up and to get it over faster. But in the 19th century, they actually thought that that was unhealthy. They thought that you needed to take a long period of time to recover, and if you sped up too much, you could actually either cause yourself to relapse into serious illness or you would harm your lifelong health. So it was best to take a long period of time to recover as fully as possible before you went back to your daily habits or went back to work. So how long do you think the Victorians thought you should recover if you've been seriously ill? Say like you've had a surgery or you've had a fever for a couple of weeks. How long should you take to get over it? A year?
Yeah. 6 months.
6 months.
6 weeks.
Others?
4 months.
Great. I'm glad that you're all thinking long term, because the answer is at least 1 month, up to 6 months, fully a year. All of those are possibilities, but a minimum of a month if you've been seriously ill. And that's for everybody. It's not just if you're rich enough. They thought everyone needs to have access to a month of no work, preferably a seaside vacation, in order to recuperate as much as possible. And their idea about that was not just that you needed that time to get over the symptoms, but also to recuperate from what they saw as the stress of modern life. So they thought that as you suffer from disease, you're not just suffering from disease. There's actually a lot more problems going on. So for example, here's a physician writing in 1837 who said, "Anxiety, unsuitable diet, unremitting labor, combined with the want of even occasional enjoyment of a pure atmosphere, aggregate the disease." So what he's saying is that in addition to whatever symptoms you're suffering, you're also probably suffering from stress, from overwork, and from environmental pollution. He's talking about people in cities here. And so that convalescent seaside trip is to counteract these kinds of stressors. So it's not just about treating disease, it's getting away and retreating from more entrenched social problems. So he goes on to say, patients need what he calls a change from the cares and duties of home to complete relaxation of body and mind. So in order to recuperate for as much as possible, medical patients in the 19th century had to basically take a vacation. They engaged in activities that we would now associate with taking a holiday. They needed especially indulgent food, they needed fresh air and new surroundings, and most of all, they needed unstructured free time. Now, the Victorians loved this idea of convalescence, and I track how they embraced it in a couple different ways. They published caregiving manuals, so the family caregivers who took care of convalescent patients could buy a book to see how to do it better. They also published manuals for the patients themselves to teach you how to luxuriate appropriately. They also published personal essays, autobiographical accounts of how much they loved convalescence after they've been ill. One famous convalescent was Wilkie Collins. He's a famous novelist who wrote books like The Woman in White and The Moonstone. And he also wrote several essays talking about how much he enjoyed his convalescent care. And this is from one of those essays where he exclaimed, "Oh, blessed idleness! After years of merciless industry that have separated us, are you and I to be brought together at last?" He claimed, whether this is true or not, that he had never taken a day off since he had been a child. So this was an opportunity where his physician told him, you cannot work anymore. You have to go on vacation. You have to recuperate your health. So he adored it. He had a wonderful time. Victorians also, we can see their emphasis on convalescent care in the fact that they built convalescent homes. And these were philanthropic institutions. This is a picture of one of the homes. And they were built so that people who couldn't afford to spend their own money on a seaside vacation could still go on these recuperative holidays after they've been seriously ill. There are hundreds of convalescent homes that are founded across the 19th century, and by the later decades, they are catering to tens of thousands of impoverished patients every year. And I include this image because I want you to sort of picture the strangeness of this. This palatial institution exists only for leisure, and it's run by donations, and these kinds of mansions sprouted up across the coast across the entire nation in order to give everyone as much of a recuperative experience as they possibly could. Now, they saw this kind of, what we would call maybe an extravagant kind of philanthropy, they saw it as a cost-saving measure. And they rationalized it in economic terms. So they thought of leisure as a kind of economy, that you built up your reserves through resting, and then you spent those reserves when you worked. And so here's one example of a Victorian writer making this argument. He says, "Daily we pay into the body bank so much, and every day we draw out so much. Some days the paying in is far excess of the withdrawal, and then we feel energetic." The problem is that, according to these writers, that in the modern age, we actually overspend our reserves too often. The problem in the 19th century was that telegrams could reach you at any time of day or night. We would now blame text messaging. There's a sort of overflow of stimulation in the modern world with the amount of information that you can have access to, the volume of things that you have to read to keep up on modern events. And so what inevitably happens, according to this writer, is that we all go what he calls body bankrupt. And once we've gone body bankrupt, we have to retreat onto those seaside convalescent holidays in order to build up our economic and physical reserves. Now, you may be asking yourself, why don't we do this now? Why don't we get to recover this way? And there's a specific answer for that, actually. Following World War I, and even more so after World War II, the focus of medicine has shifted from indulging in that long recuperative holiday to shortening the time of recuperation and making medicine itself as efficient as possible. So here's an example of an early 20th century physician who's working in World War I, explaining how he sees rehabilitation. And so he says, as soon as the patient is fit to get about, he should have some occupation, both for his mental, moral, and physical welfare. So this model of a speedy recovery is clearly born out of a wartime mentality. They needed to get the soldiers as well as the workers back to their posts as soon as possible. But the problem is that that model of rehabilitative medicine persisted even outside of wartime. Physicians after World War I wanted to encourage patients to walk very quickly. Some even suggested that surgical patients should be made to get up from the operating table itself and walk out of the surgical theater. Others, probably more reasonably, suggested bed exercises so you could start strengthening your muscles and getting back to some kind of labor even before you were able to physically stand. And the result of all of this is that the Victorian idea of convalescence became more and more obsolete. And by the mid-20th century, at the founding of the National Health Service, those convalescent homes that I showed a picture of were not taken up for nationalization because they were not seen to be sufficiently efficient, they weren't seen to be sufficiently medical, so they weren't brought into the NHS, and so the few that remained continued to be philanthropic and independent, and they sort of closed down slowly over the years. So given this history, it's very fair to ask, why study it? Why study something that didn't actually get passed down to us today? We don't recover like this woman luxuriating in the chair and staring at the bird anymore. And I think that unfamiliarity is actually what's interesting about 19th century convalescence. We also talk about overwork and stress, but we don't even consider this kind of medicalized leisure as a potential answer. And we would certainly find it very strange to be asked to donate money to someone else's seaside vacation. And for me, the unfamiliarity is precisely the point. The Victorians were overworked and overwhelmed just like us, but they imagined an alternative where physical weakness could be a very positive thing because it gave you an opportunity to slow down, to think new thoughts, to read for fun. And so they found convalescence to be a very positive experience, and we're not trying to rush it at all. So my work examines this model of rehabilitation, and I look at it as a specific kind of time or temporal experience, a way that the Victorians sort of lived in their own bodies. And I do that in order to better understand how they coped with familiar problems like stress and overwork and productivity. And I also want to ask new questions about how we allocate our own time and what we see as an efficient or an appropriate use of our own time today. So that's what I work on. Thank you all for listening. We have a few evaluation sheets for you to fill out if you would like. And I believe we have a dance coming up in about 15 minutes, or about in 5 minutes if you want to rush off to that. And I'll be here to answer any questions you have. So thank you.